So this video is not really about Venezuela. It's about how power behaves when it feels challenged. And it's about why what just happened in Venezuela should matter far beyond Latin America, especially to Africa and the global south. Because once you strip away the language of justice and order, what you're left with is something far older and something that is far more familiar. So late last night, we saw the United States launched military strikes in Venezuela. We saw air power, precision weapons, a direct assault on the capital. And all this was framed as justice. It was framed as order. It was framed as something that was necessary. But strip away that language, and what you're looking at is something far older. So powerful countries used to hide this kind of behavior. You know, they spoke softly, they wrapped force in diplomatic language, they insisted colonialism was over. But what we're seeing in Venezuela tells us a completely different story. Now, this is not an anomaly. This is proof that neocolonialism remains central to the United States global strategy. When a country decides it no longer likes another country's leadership, it stops pretending neutrality, it intervenes. And this is exactly what we are witnessing in Venezuela. And no matter how this is packaged, this is one state imposing its will on another sovereign nation, removing leadership and shaping outcomes to suit its own interests. So this is not about law. This is not about democracy. It is about control. So this is control of political direction, control of the resources, as Mr. Donald Trump admitted himself, control of alignment. And once you recognize that pattern, the rhetoric stops mattering. So that also explains why key allies were not even informed. So just listen to the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer.
Have you spoken to Donald Trump about what's happened in Venezuela?
No, I haven't, and it's obviously a fast-moving situation, and we need to establish all the facts. What I can say is that the UK was not involved in any way in this operation, and as you'd expect, we're focusing on British nationals in Venezuela and working very closely with our embassy. And so I will want to talk to the President, I will want to talk to allies, but at the moment, I think we need to establish the facts. I think President Trump is doing a press conference later, so hopefully more information will come out then.
So what makes this moment especially revealing is a contradiction, because the same leadership that promised fewer wars, less intervention, less restraint, is now relying on airstrikes, it's relying on sanctions, it's relying on coercion. So clearly the language has changed, but the behavior has not. So peace becomes a slogan, while force remains the tool. So if you think this has nothing to do with Africa, then that would be a very huge mistake, because that logic being used in Venezuela is definitely transferable. So in other words, any country that resists alignment, controls strategic resources, or pursues independent partnerships can be framed as a problem. So narratives are flexible, justifications can be manufactured, and pressure can always be escalated. So we've seen early versions of this playbook before. This is not the first time that we've seen America behave the way it has done. This attack also says a great deal about the declining power, because a state confident in its influence does not act like this. Storming in at night, arresting a sovereign leader like a bandit, that is not strength. You know, it's definitely not strength, it is desperation. Now, there's no doubt that drugs flow through Venezuela, but they also flow through Mexico, across Central America. And when you look at the data drawn from the UNODC or the DEA or the United States State Department assessments, the picture becomes even more clearer. Production is concentrated in a small number of countries, and transit is dominated by specific corridors. And the data shows Venezuela plays a role, but it's not the main source. It's not the primary route into the United States. You've got all these other countries, as you can see from that table, that actually beats Venezuela when it comes to narcotics and these illicit drugs. So that distinction matters when narcotics are used to justify foreign policy or military action. So when the United States behaves the way it has, this is not confidence, it's definitely anxiety, because as global influence shifts, persuasion becomes even harder. So what's there remaining is to use force, and force tends to fill the gap. So sanctions replace dialogue, threats replace diplomacy, and military action replaces consent. That is definitely not leadership, that is control under pressure. Now, if you listen to Maduro just one day before his capture, the man was willing to talk, the man was willing to negotiate over oil, the man was willing to negotiate over the drugs agreement. In fact, the man even spoke to Mr. Trump over the telephone, and he was very confident that things were going well and that things were going to be okay.
Nosotros hemos tenido, Ramón, una sola conversación. Él me llamó el viernes 21 de noviembre desde la Casa Blanca estaba. Y yo estaba en el Palacio de Miraflores. Conversamos 10 minutos. Y fue una conversación, como yo he dicho, respetuosa, muy respetuosa.
¿Qué le dijo
cordial.
¿Qué le dijo el presidente Trump?
Lo primero que me dijo, Mr. President Maduro.
Excelente.
Y yo le dije, Mr. President Donald Trump. Y creo que fue hasta agradable esa conversación. Pero de ahí las evoluciones post-conversación no han sido agradables. Esperemos. Y al pueblo de Estados Unidos, yo le digo lo que le he venido diciendo. Aquí en Venezuela tiene un pueblo hermano. Al pueblo de Estados Unidos, inclusive le digo, aquí tienen a un gobierno amigo. Empezar a conversar en serio, con datos en la mano. Y el gobierno de Estados Unidos lo sabe, porque se lo hemos dicho a muchos de sus voceros, que si quieren conversar seriamente de un acuerdo de combate contra el narcotráfico, estamos listos. Que si quieren petróleo de Venezuela, está lista Venezuela para inversiones estadounidenses como con Chevron, cuando quieran, donde quieran y como quieran.
And then obviously the following day the man was captured, and obviously that must have come as a shock to him and his people. Now, obviously, looking at the outcome of the events, negotiation was never the objective. What the United States wanted was bigger than one man. So history shows this pattern clearly. Empires do not become restrained as they decline. They become more aggressive. So let's call this what it is without sugarcoating. This is imperialism. This is colonialism, neo-colonialism, all combined. So what has just happened is definitely not liberation. It's definitely not justice, and it's definitely not peace. There's nothing that looks like peace in what has just happened. This is coercion dressed as order. And if this can be justified in Venezuela, it can be justified anywhere. This is why this matters, and this is why it should not be ignored. I think people need to speak out about this, and the leaders really need to condemn what has happened without shame. This is NB, and this is war we are reclaiming.